Thank you very much for having me. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me over your lunch break. Um, as mentioned, my name is Hannah Carroll. I am the co-founder of IIRSM Limited and a senior environmental consultant. Um, I'm based in Newcastle upon Tyne in the Northeast, although you may be able to tell from my accent that I'm not originally from the Northeast. Apparently an unconvincing Geordie, but that's because I'm not actually even originally from this country. I was born and raised in South Africa, and that is kind of where my passion for the environment, was cemented in my early years. Working as an environmental consultant, I help organizations with strategic sustainability. And one of the cornerstones of that is legislation and regulatory compliance. And it transpires that this is something that's really challenging for businesses. However, it's something that I find somewhat enjoyable. So this is the mission of the business, to help organizations access this and make something that's quite a chore slightly easier. ICOR Systems is a cloud-based solution that allows organizations to audit themselves against environmental legislation, as I say, to try and reduce the barriers to understanding what you have to do and how you have to do it. And obviously, one of the key things that keeps coming up when I'm talking with organizations about regulatory compliance or what the future of legislation looks like, net zero is, in fact, the topic of the moment. We know that there's change coming. But how can organizations kind of predict what changes are likely to come and how they can begin to prepare for those changes and ultimately what that's going to mean to them? So what I plan on covering in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes during your lunch break, obviously leaving enough time for questions and answers at the end, is some of the principles of environmental legislation. So unfortunately, I can't deep dive into every regulation that exists around net zero or what it means or what its implications are. But I'm hoping that by taking kind of a principle approach, if you understand the cornerstones of how legislation will be derived, it might allow you to anticipate how it would affect you in the future. I will then touch on the regulatory landscape for net zero, pull in some key concepts that I think you should be paying attention to while you're trying to plan your journey towards net zero, what that might look like for you. And then a couple of hints and tips at the end in terms of how to keep up with this legislation that is constantly evolving and ever changing. So quite a lot to get through, but hopefully will be valuable for you guys and kind of set you off thinking about what this means to you. I always like to start with, bringing it right back to basics. So this concept of environmental legislation has historically had quite a bad reputation. It's difficult to do. It's super confusing. Sometimes it feels restrictive, like red tape. It can be very expensive. And all of these things are true or can be true. But I like to come back to kind of the cornerstone of why environmental legislation exists in the first place. And the purpose of environmental legislation is ultimately to protect the natural environment from human activities in order to ensure human survivability and continued thrivability. So ultimately, these laws only exist because the activities that we do as organizations tend to have a negative impact on the environment. And a negative impact on the environment has a negative impact on communities, individuals, businesses, kind of societies, countries as a whole. So they exist. And yes, they can be a little bit difficult, but they exist for our own self-preservation, to protect the planet and to protect us as part of it. Now, a lot of legislation that is developed kind of based on key principles. So I just want to kind of run through those principles, and you'll see the application of these in the way laws have come into existence and also the consultations that are currently underway in terms of what legislation for the future looks like. So the first principle is something called the polluter pays principle. And essentially, it does what it says on the tin. Organizations which are responsible for causing pollution should pay to clean it up and or should pay for measures to prevent it from reoccurring. Now, cleaning up pollution has actually been phased out of legislation. Organizations have a principal responsibility to not cause pollution, and that is paramount. But for activities that we know will ultimately become environmental issues, there is kind of a burden on the producer. So we see this with packaging, packaging manufacturers. have to join packaging compliance scheme because all packaging ultimately ends up as a waste stream, which is something that the country has to deal with. And this principle is likely to be applied to carbon in the future for organizations that are unable to reduce their carbon emissions. It is likely that there will be some kind of financial consequence for the kind of privilege of being able to create carbon in the first place. So polluter pays principle sits at the heart of a lot of legislation. Another regulatory principle is something called best available technique. So again, everything is about hopefully preventing pollution before it occurs. And organizations have a responsibility to implement control measures which will prevent pollution. And what is considered best available technique will change as science and technology changes. So it is defined as advancing techniques which are reasonably achievable, best practicable, and best available. But that doesn't mean all of these are technologically complex. If you store oil on your organization or at your site, for example, the best available technique to prevent an oil spill is to keep it in a bund. And bunds aren't expensive and they're not technologically or scientifically complex. So the best available technique might in fact be a simple solution, but there's an obligation to find solutions that serve to prevent pollution. And again, if you think about what that means in the journey towards net zero, it's going to be around what are the best available techniques, ultimately reduce your carbon emissions, and how can your organization begin to implement those. Another principle is something called the proximity principle. So this kind of states that parts of a business activity that are known to cause environmental harm or could potentially cause environmental harm have to be dealt with as close to the source as possible. And we've seen this a lot with waste legislation. 10, 20, 30 years ago, it used to be that you could throw your waste away and it was exported out of the country and it was someone else's problem to deal with, except we know in reality that's not really what happened, because all of the kind of natural, chemical, biological, physical processes of this planet has brought all of that waste back to us. There is no way. It says where it's produced is where it should be dealt with, is where it should be handled with. And again, a lot of the carbon legislation is saying, as the UK, it is our responsibility to deal with our carbon emissions. And the proximity principle is something that actually underpins a preference for carbon reduction as opposed to carbon offsetting, because carbon offsetting is generally outside of the scope of your kind of immediate geographical area. So we have this obligation to take ownership for the potential pollutants that we would create as an organization. And then finally, there's this overarching, principle of protection and control. So firstly, the environment must be protected as a whole. So we need to consider kind of life cycle of products and services and the impacts that each stage of that life cycle might have on the environment. Organizations must also try to prevent pollution, not just control it. So again, there's been a really big cultural shift and a regulatory shift in that, there were permissions on pollution. You could, as long as it was within certain thresholds, and now those thresholds are dramatically reducing. We have to prevent pollution, not just kind of deal with it. And also we're seeing kind of this idea of the environment as a whole being implemented through international frameworks that are kind of introducing regenerative principles. So now it's not just about not causing pollution, it's actually about how do we enhance nature? How do we make the environment better than what we currently have or what we've had, in consideration for future generations? So all of these principles, if you kind of reflect on laws that you might be aware of that apply to your organization, you're likely to see that they contain one or more of these principles, one or more of these elements. There's a financial penalty, there's a preventative penalty, you're required to use best available technique, and ultimately we should be looking for ways to make things better. It's not just about control anymore. So those are the kind of key principles. Another thing I just wanted to touch on in this quite a theoretical start really to the session is also kind of the structure of legislation. So like how legislation comes into existence. And the thing to note is that it all begins at that kind of international treaty and agreement level. So the UK is a signatory on pretty much every international treaty or agreement that is designed to reduce the impact that human activities are having on the environment. And as an individual signatory on those, we as a country have made a commitment to ultimately work towards those treaties and agreements. Now, it used to be that this then came through the EU, and the EU would kind of make sense of whatever that treaty was trying to achieve, and then they would either implement directives or regulations which the UK would adopt, and we would implement that through acts, regulations, statutory instruments. Now, obviously, we've moved out of the EU. So all that means is we've lost the middleman, but that doesn't detract from our signatory on those international treaties and agreements. It just means that we have to figure out what those commitments mean at a more UK-based level. But obviously, we're still working in a world where a lot of businesses are cooperating with Europe, trading to Europe, importing, exporting to Europe. And therefore, it's quite difficult to not think about European legislation in terms of how our own regulations are going to be developed in the future, because they need to be cooperative, they need to be collective. And this is bringing about some really interesting background stuff. And I say interesting, I'm aware that when I talk about legislation, I use that word quite loosely. Not everybody does think that this is interesting, but there is quite a significant piece of legislation that's been working away in the background called the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Act. And this has been quite a complex process to help us figure out how we're going to integrate European legislation into the UK. Obviously, when we exited the EU, everything automatically got adopted. And it's been kind of years of progress to work out what are we keeping, what aren't we keeping, and also how do we actually regulate some of those things that used to be regulated at an EU level. Now, this law covered everything that came over from the EU. So it covered all of the headlines. It was HR, it was finance, it was health and safety, it was environmental, amongst a whole bunch of other really important areas for organizations. And it comes into full effect at the end of this year on the 31st of December, where European law is now going to become assimilated law. So a lot of it is sticking around. Now, what's really interesting is how many people don't actually know that this is happening, and kind of the complexities that an EU exit caused in terms of how we regulate within the UK. So this survey from the British Chamber of Commerce went across 938 businesses, and they identified two things which I think are quite interesting. The first was, do you know about the retained EU law bill? It's been quite controversial. The majority of it did not. 41% knew no details and 30% didn't even know it existed. Only 4% claimed to have comprehensively understood what it was going to mean for their organizations. But the other thing that the survey pulled out was whether businesses had an appetite for deregulation. Like, did we want to not, align with other countries or other frameworks for environmental management? And the majority of participants said deregulation is not what is wanted. We want trade, import and export to be as easy as possible. And that means we need to continue to align with Europe as well as other countries. So it's quite, interesting stuff in the. So that's kind of a high-level overview of legislation, how it exists, some of the challenges that we're facing today in the UK, but really, I think the takeaway is those principles will help you anticipate what the future of net zero is likely to look like, what consequences of some of that legislation is likely to be for organizations, so you can be kind of more proactive in preventing the worst of it. Polluter pays is a good place to start. So the less you produce, the less it is likely to cost an organization. You'd be more prepared for the changes that come in the future. So I just want to kind of work through the story, really, of how we are now on this journey of net zero. It dates back a fair few years, at least 35, if not a few more. And kind of the first international agreement that the UK signed up to was the Montreal Protocol. And the Montreal Protocol, as well as others, aimed to reduce CFCs and HFCs out of the environment, we know that those cause the hole in the ozone layer. So that was the first one that was looking at the impact that we were having on climate and kind of global warming greenhouse gas emissions. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol come in 2005. It was actually adopted a lot earlier than that, but these things take time. And this obviously then laid the foundations for developed countries to begin to reduce their emissions by an average on 5% below 1990 levels. Remember that the UK was an individual signatory on this, even though for the time it was implemented through the EU. But what that agreement did was lay the foundations for the UK Climate Change Act. So in 2008, the UK made a legally binding commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to at least 80% of 1990 levels by that 2050 deadline. So it's kind of always been this way. You know, there's nothing new coming in terms of the narrative of net zero. We were always going to be reducing, and 2050 was always the deadline. And it also puts some responsibility on our government to make sure that this actually happens, that this is what we achieved. Now then, Paris Agreement, 2015. So about 10 years later, after the Kyoto Protocol, and this was kind of the point in time where we realized that, in fact, an 80% reduction is not going to be good enough. Climate science progressed, technology progressed, and we understood that suddenly there was a very clear line in the sand where we didn't want global warming to exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. And then each country made a commitment, fine, that's the line that we're not going to exceed. So what does reduction actually look like in order for us to help, in order to help us stay within this parameter? And this is kind of where conversations about net zero start to come up. And net zero is where the amount of greenhouse gases that emitted equals the amount that is removed. So it is a balance, you've emitted what, but we need to remove the same amount. And this kind of being climate neutral or carbon neutral. I will concede, I'm not digging into it too much, but I think some of the language used around net zero, carbon reduction, climate action can be quite confusing. So again, it's just really reading into the terminology that's being used and making sure that those words make sense to you. But this is kind of where net zero came from. We're trying to get lower or equal to than what we produce. And this made us change our Climate Change Act. So in 2019, this was just, beginning of COVID, in fact, that the UK changed the law to make this commitment that we were going to be 100% lower than our 1990 baseline. So the first was an 80% reduction, but now it's 100% lower. And this made the UK government quite popular because we were the first to legally make that commitment, although it has not been without some kind of complexity, which I will dig into. So out of that agreement, what we've then started to see over the last couple of years is more and more regulation coming through for businesses from a number of different areas. So everything that covers polluter pays, something like the climate change levy. If you use fossil fuels, there is a cost to that. It is polluter pays principle. Climate change agreements, energy efficiency of buildings, equipment, products, services, buildings, eco-design, energy labeling. Like, it touches every part of, the whole environment, that life cycle of products and services. And in fact, net zero is likely to be achieved through other areas of regulation that might not on the surface of it seem to be net zero legislation, but it is ultimately going to be how we build our cities, how we design our buildings, how we organize public transport, and kind of the raft of complexity that sits underneath the reality of how do we get 100% lower than that 1990 baseline. And obviously the two pieces of legislation that came in that most significantly affected organizations, one called ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. So that came in, and it was a requirement on large organizations to conduct an energy audit every 4 years, and from that energy audit to identify opportunities for energy reduction within their organizations. And one of the more significant ones that, I think, again, is laying the foundation for a call on transparency in the future. So for businesses, to measure, something like ESOS made you measure your energy consumption. That might have been data that a lot of businesses might not have had previously. It allows you to set a baseline. It helps you identify where there are areas to do better. But then we had something come through called SECR, which actually was implemented through the Companies Act. So it's business legislation that's implementing a net zero objective. And this was something called Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, the SECR regulations in 2018. And this was kind of groundbreaking because this was the first time that organizations, large organizations again, had to publicly communicate their carbon footprint with their annual financial accounts. So not only did they have to collect the data, not only did they have to make sense of the data, but they also have to make this data available so that anybody who then looks to this business could gauge how they perform in terms of carbon emissions and whether that business was in fact then committed to reducing their carbon emissions. And obviously, we can see that this kind of changes everything because if you're reporting it to Companies House, it's on the Companies House portal. It is very publicly available. It is very transparent. And certainly in the journey towards net zero, transparency is going to become more and more important. We really need to understand what carbon emissions look like, taking a life cycle perspective. So this currently focuses on large businesses. Both of these do, ESOS and SECR. But as you might imagine, there is a lot of chatter as to whether the law is going to kind of open up to medium businesses or small businesses. And it might be regulatory driven, but actually what is interesting in kind of commercial context is that because large organizations are having to make this information publicly available, they are now starting to ask questions down their supply chain. They are anticipating that the categories of carbon that they have to report are going to expand because we need better data, we need better understanding of performance. And once you start expanding, then no business is an island. You can't do it alone. So it needs then supply chain engagement. So this is definitely pushing through the value chain from a regulatory perspective, but also from larger organizations who are encompassed in the legislation, asking more from their suppliers, more from their value chain, so that they can bring that into their communication and their net zero strategies and the steps that they're going to take. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that the changes to the Climate Change Act and these net zero targets have not been without controversy. And I think it is important to understand that legislation is complicated. It certainly is. But we did have a bit of a significant turning point actually in 2022, where the UK government was taken to court. So all of these things are happening. There is progress, obviously, new regulations coming in, new requirements for organizations to begin to get to grips with their carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, if we look beyond that. But actually, it was found that the UK government didn't have a good enough plan in place as to how, at a country level, we were actually going to achieve this. As individual organizations are off measuring and off quantifying and off reporting, how does that all feed into the UK achieving net zero, 100% reduction on those 99 levels, on those, 1999, 1990 levels, apologies. And what stood up in court was, in fact, that the UK had committed internationally to reduce its carbon emissions as part of the Paris Agreement, and then took that and put it into domestic law and then failed to have a plan in place. So they were taken to court, they lost in the Supreme Court. And what came out of that was obviously an objective that we need a better plan, we need a more robust plan. And that plan is now going to be the foundation of regulation that we're likely to see going forward in the future. I do know that there is a lot of noise in the news. It's coming up for election time, like things are complicated, but it gives me some comfort just to remember that regardless of who's in power, the UK is committed to net zero, and therefore anybody that comes in should be moving this agenda forward, um, because that is what we're required to do. That's the law. And we also know that there's a strong kind of ethical, moral reason why net zero is so important. And that's kind of what I cling to amongst all of the noise and just bring it back to, the law ultimately is black and white, and there is a target, and therefore we have to keep moving towards that target. Now, I've kind of allude on this, but I just wanted to make some points about what what net zero would look like in reality. And I've mentioned, your value chain, your supply chain a fair bit. In my experience working with organizations, once we do start to quantify carbon emissions, we do our scope 1 and scope 2, which is everything that the organization is directly responsible for. And eventually you hit a point where you can't really do much more on that. You've measured it, you've quantified it, you're putting measures in, but we need to start looking beyond the four walls of any organization. And what we're finding is that when we actually do begin to expand our measurement and encompass our supply chain, the reality of our carbon footprint is not within our own four walls. It is in fact sitting within that supply chain. And what I'm seeing is kind of whole life cycle carbon footprints, showing that actually up to 99% of an organization's greenhouse gas emissions are likely to exist. And 99% is the highest that I've had. On average, I think it's around 60 or 70%, but it's definitely more significant than you might think it is. So this journey towards net zero is really thinking about embodied carbon and what those value chains look like. And currently, the legislation's not touching on that. It's kind of hitting those big organizations who are taking decisions to push it through their supply chains. But in order for us to actually achieve net zero, there are going to be, or there will have to be kind of interventions for every organization of any size to try and understand what greenhouse gas emissions look like in reality. The problem is we're not measuring it properly. So how can we achieve 100% reduction if we don't know what 100% of emissions look like at the moment? And that is, this really weird area where legislation and science kind of need to talk to each other, and they're not actually moving on the same journey. So there are definitely some real world gaps in our knowledge about how we would achieve net zero. But again, I'm encouraged by the organizations that are very much taking this in their own hands and saying, well, we're going to keep pushing, we're going to keep measuring, we're going to keep engaging up and down our value chain, because A, it's good value for us. It helps us manage our risk going forward. It gives us better insights into what we're doing, but it also moves forward on this climate action agenda that a lot of organizations really do care about. The other thing is this idea of circularity. So once we start looking up and down the value chain, and we're thinking about the Paris Agreement not exceeding this 1.5 degrees centigrade, up to 99% exist, within the life cycle of products and services, it then naturally leads on to actually the only way to achieve net zero is to stop taking, making, and disposing and think about circularity. If we want to eliminate, reduce carbon emissions, we can stop doing the things that create them, but then we have to rethink our business models, we have to rethink our processes, we have to rethink about the value of waste and consumption, and what are the opportunities to kind of close the loop on the extraction and processing of natural resources. So the principles of circularity kind of are the opposite of what the principles for law is. So the law says if you pollute, you pay. And circular economy says, actually, we don't pollute and we don't waste, because nothing is waste. We look at ways to keep products and materials in circulation at their highest value. We ultimately use these processes to regenerate nature, to make the world a better place. And I think what is quite interesting there is kind of the changing terminology, that saying like one man's waste is another man's, gold. It is that, like, maybe we should stop talking about waste completely and think about these resources are moving perpetually through our organizations. Are we getting maximum value from those resources? And again, we're starting to see these principles of circularity and regeneration coming through the Environment Act 2021. These are just kind of the headlines, but it major focus on environmental protection, waste and resource efficiency, water protection, discharges that cause pollution, and then how do we protect the environment? How do we regenerate nature? And taking it right back, the only reason law exists is to protect the environment from our activities. And how do we regenerate nature to ensure that societies and businesses continue to thrive? And that then opens up something called the circular economy package, which again touch everything. So it's, you can't talk about circularity in isolation. It's kind of the nature of it. But we're seeing circularity come in two ways at the moment. It's kind of the production of products that we know are ultimately going to be challenging to deal with in the environment. And it's putting big polluter pays on products at the end of their life if maximum value has not been obtained from them in those processes. It's touching hazardous materials, it's touching vehicles, batteries, electrical equipment, packaging, permits, operations, how businesses ultimately function. And a lot of this is kind of high level at the moment, and we're going to start seeing, the specific regulations come through that tell us what we can and can't do. And I know it's probably not what anybody wants to hear, but it is going to get stricter. There is going to be more control over how we do certain things so that ultimately we don't cause pollution, we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we look for continuous opportunities for circularity, which in fact, might be quite exciting for us. And this is it, that there are actually opportunities in completely rethinking the way that we do things. So this is an independent review of the government's net zero target. So this came after they went to court and lost. And this kind of looked at, the flip side of it. If we're not doing good enough at the moment, then what could it look like if we fully embrace this? And I think some of these conclusions that came out of it are really relevant. They're really relevant for the UK level, but even for organizations and individuals, there is immense value in progress towards net zero. Obviously, I think the key headlines for organizations, the benefits of investing in net zero today will far outweigh the costs in the future. The unlocking ambition of places and communities, collaboration, that stakeholder engagement is necessary in order to help us progress. Conclusion 6 really sticks out. Net zero by 2050 remains the right target for the UK. So there's no grounds to wiggle on this, which is backed by science, widely followed, and is creating real opportunity. And obviously, we must now decisively to seize the economic opportunities and smooth this transition. It's not to say it won't be bumpy, but a proactive approach is obviously always less stressful than a reactive approach, especially with some of this regulation that we're likely to see coming in. And then just thinking, those value chain considerations, obviously get your house in order first. Think about what you're measuring, how well you're measuring it. Could you communicate your greenhouse gas emissions? And then begin to look up and down the supply chain. Doing it voluntarily and being able to take your time to figure all of this out will, as I mentioned, be much less stressful than kind of having a new regulation like the streamlined energy and carbon reporting pop up and suddenly your business is in scope and you haven't got the data that you would need in order to be able to comply with that particular regulation. So I am doing all right for time. I'm coming up to the end here. So I just wanted to give you a couple of hints and tips really for ensuring compliance. I've touched on some of the headline regulations. I will not lie, this is my job, keeping up on top of legislation, and it is not an easy job. The legislation is always changing, it's constantly evolving. Interpreting it and understanding it is a challenge. What does it mean? So I don't sugarcoat this and say, you know, this is an easy process, but I do fundamentally believe it is a critically important risk management process, because if we cannot anticipate, you know, the regulatory responsibilities that are going to fall on us in the future, then it's, yeah, kind of getting caught off guard, and that's not a nice feeling for anybody. We've talked a lot about legislation, but obviously I do see in reality, you know, the pressure for net zero is coming from a number of different sources. So again, I just don't think that this is anything that any of us are going to be able to escape, and, you know, rightly so. This is a problem that needs to be solved. But a lot of organizations are getting pressure from key clients. It's part of due diligence. It's a necessary part of your supply chain management. And then depending on whether you kind of operate permits, licenses, your local authority controls, there might already be kind of local, you know, criteria that you have to meet. And also for organizations that work within kind of approved codes of practice or international accreditations like ISO 14001, or investors in the environment, all of that requires you, A, to keep on top of your legislation, and B, to be in a position where you can demonstrate compliance with your, you know, kind of, well, compliance obligations, but those could be regulations and the needs and expectations of your key stakeholders, you know, that ultimately mean you have to be measuring and demonstrating progress towards net zero. I'm a systems person by background. I know that that might relate to a lot of you guys, but big fan of the PDCA process. So it's about planning, it's about horizon scanning, it's about finding out how you can find out what you should probably be aware of, what's going to affect your business, what does your business affect, keeping records, you know, writing a procedure, documenting what you have to know, engaging your teams, communicating with relevant people, and putting in processes to monitor, measure, and audit your performance. And sitting underneath that is kind of a core maintaining awareness of the regulatory changes. Now, in order to do that, you kind of start through a process of identifying relevant legislation, assess and understand how it applies to your organization, keep records of that, because if this is your job to do this, you're not the only person who needs to know about these laws or what they mean for your organization. So make sure that you communicate with relevant people. Understand what you have to do. I really think that's the hardest part. And then assess whether what you're doing is working, whether it's right. It's one thing to say, this is the law and we know what we're supposed to be doing. The big question is, are you doing it? And could you demonstrate that? Could you prove that to anybody that came and asked that? And obviously some kind of formalized process to regularly check sources, you know, blogs, articles, the .gov websites. There's loads of free resources out there to kind of get an idea of, even if it's not specific laws that are going to come in, like what are the themes, what are the principles, what are the conversations that are being had around how net zero can realistically be achieved. And that will allow you to anticipate the steps that you need to take a little bit better. In terms of helpful sources, obviously there is legislation.gov. Spend a lot of time on this website. I know not a lot of people do, and I will again concede it's not always super easy to use, but it does kind of help you keep up, so you can set flags on different pages. So if there's particular laws that you know are highly relevant to your organization, you can kind of have those feeding into you. And then obviously you can keep track of updates or amendments as they come through. If you are based in Scotland or Northern Ireland, there is an incredible resource called NetRegs, and they have in fact just shared a whole raft of what they call kind of regulatory guidance documents. So kind of interpreting some of the legislation for Scotland and Northern Ireland and translating that. So not reading the law, but kind of understanding what it means, what you're supposed to do, things you should be thinking about. It is a bit unfair that this resource exists for Scotland and Northern Ireland. There is no equivalent in the UK, unfortunately, as a free resource. The laws are different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but again, there is some commonality because we're all signatories on those international agreements. So it's not a perfect rule, but you can kind of anticipate if Scotland's doing it, then England might, or if England's doing it, then Scotland might. And yeah, you can kind of, again, identify those trends. Within the England, again, we have the Environment Agency. They don't really publish guidance documents, but a lot of, what you're allowed to do as a business or what certain laws mean or support for certain parts of your environmental management, you are able to work with the Environment Agency directly. And then, of course, there are paid for services like ICOR or others that help make this a little bit easier, that give you kind of tools to audit yourselves, review compliance, and most importantly, evidence and demonstrate compliance with confidence. Because that's it, it's the law, and we have a responsibility not to break it. So that is I've done all right with time there, actually. So kind of three headlines. I said I was going to talk through the principles of environmental legislation, a bit of an overview of the regulatory landscape for net zero, which I really hope, I know it's overwhelming. I know there's a lot of information, and unfortunately I can't delve into the specifics in the context of this workshop, but I hope that was helpful. And then some of my hints and tips for how to ensure environmental compliance. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thanks, Tamara. I'm amazed at how much you coherently packed into 45 minutes or under 45 minutes. So huge congratulations on that point. We've had a couple of questions. I think the audience is UK and outside of the UK today. So we've had a question. Net zero carbon emission is the target of all countries around the world or the UK only?
Yes and no. So the Paris Agreement, every country that was a signatory on the Paris Agreement has ultimately committed to net zero. It's just the speed at which they will do that, where there is some kind of variation. Obviously, the COP meetings, Conference of the Party meetings, are supposed to occur every couple of years to kind of keep us on track for the Paris Agreement. The next one's coming up in a couple of weeks. Which will be held in Dubai, I believe, and they'll kind of review how each country is progressing. I've taken a perspective of UK legislation, so I have very much talked about it in that context, but this is a world problem, so you're dead right. Everywhere should be aiming for net zero, because that's the only way that we can combat climate change.
Great, thank you. I'll just read out a couple of compliments here. Tammy, you did the justice to the presentation. Well done. Thank you very much. Thanks for the overview. I have no questions, but appreciate it. Thanks, Tamara. A lot covered in a short time, but most useful. And then we have another couple of questions as well. So one question is, great presentation. Thank you. I would have loved to have had a summary of the main points in your presentation. I can't see any slide. Any chance that could be sent out later? That's probably a big ask, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share a PDF of this presentation, and obviously the recording will be available. The other thing I would just recommend there is that I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and I do a lot of kind of educational posts around some of these things, so it might just be worth following me there, and then by all means reach out if you have kind of more specific questions.
Great. If you want to send the PDF to me, I can send it out to the attendees with a link to your LinkedIn profile, if that would help everyone.
That would be great.
Thank you. And then we've had a question here from Patricia. What is the difference between net zero carbon and nearly zero carbon? Can you please elaborate?
Oh, so Trisha, I have like a lot of opinions about the words that are used around net zero at the moment, and I think it's really, really confusing. Nearly net zero or nearly zero feel might border on kind of greenwashing. So, but it is that, nearly, I think, is the key word there. It's not net zero, it's only nearly net zero. Net zero carbon is 100% below the threshold. So 1990 levels, we need to get to that, and then we need to go 100% below that. And that is net zero. Anything that's nearly is obviously not net zero. Although could anybody truly claim net zero at the moment is a bit of a TBC. And that comes around some of the challenges in those kind of supply chain emissions that potentially up to 99%. If you're not measuring it, you don't actually know if you're net zero. But yeah, I think the key distinction there is that nearly. It's not quite, nearly, but not quite.
That's a really good explanation. Even I understood that. We've got another question here for you, which starts with yet another compliment. Thanks for your presentation. It's very insightful. I wish to know more about the development for aviation industry development, as we know it's a big CO2 emission industry.
It is. So it's not the biggest. I think aviation accounts for 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, every percentage matters. Remember, net zero is 100%, so even a 4% reduction would be valuable on this journey. It's obviously complicated. I think as an industry, aviation does have a bit of a bad rap. And it is not without its complexities, but at the same time, it is an industry that is quite self-aware. So it costs a lot of money and fuel. It costs a lot to run airports from a business perspective. Resource efficiency and reducing or eliminating waste is, a priority, and a lot of kind of steps that they're taking are slightly ahead of regulation. And other things that they've done that are quite amazing. So like, redundant aeroplanes, like 99% recycle rates, kind of almost full circularity on aeroplanes and the value of aeroplanes. So there's some really good stuff. I think what we see about aviation that is, creates this kind of negative perception is quite around how people use, airlines and flights. So things like private jets, out of that 4%, private jets have a far bigger impact than a giant Boeing that's absolutely packed to the brim. And, holistically, the impact might be better, but if you kind of break it down to passenger, individual greenhouse gas emissions, if you have 200 people on a plane versus one person on a plane, that 200 person flight is more efficient or is as efficient as it could be. There's lots of interesting research about alternative fuel types, airline design. So pros and cons, complicated, but that is true for probably most sectors. But there is some interesting stuff and there are lessons to learn.
Great, thank you. That's all for the questions today. There's quite a few questions out, but thank you so much for sharing your time, knowledge, and expertise with us today. You clearly know your stuff, judging by your presentation. And it's been a real pleasure having you here today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'll send out the presentation next week when Tama's had a chance to send it to me, and I'll send out a link to Tama's LinkedIn profile. So please do follow her on LinkedIn. I know I follow you and you do share a lot of interesting information on there. So just to remind everyone, I will be uploading the presentation onto the IIRSM YouTube channel next week also. So if you have any colleagues that you think would be interested in watching, please do share the link. So thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon or a good evening, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.